If your organization doesn't have that strong baseline established, I'd strongly recommend the first order of business is let's get current state really well understood. And then we can get into this more advanced step of starting to do scenario planning and what ifs around.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey folks, welcome back to a show of SimplyTrade, our SimplyTrade podcast series here on several different things. And we are excited. It's into the new year. And one of the things that comes in, you look at different goals, different things. It's probably going to be a good time to, if people do their resolutions for all of 30 days or whatever it takes.
No, actually, Andy, there's an official date. There is officially the second Friday of every year is considered around the world Quitter's Day. So,
is it?
It's like a thing. Google it, people. Google it. Quitter's Day. So when you Google it, you'll find that on Friday, January the 12th was Quitter's Day. So if you made it past that day and you're still holding to your New Year's resolution, then hey, you made it past most everybody. So,
well, I will say that I have, most people are looking at trying to lose weight and exercise and things of that nature, and I've actually done pretty well this past year in that I just hit a point and I said, I need to get myself back in shape and whatnot, and I've gotten to where I'm doing planks. You know what a plank is?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
and I didn't know this, but I have apparently done pretty well on this. Is that I'm up to 2.5 minute planks, and then I'll do like 35 to 40 push-ups, and I'll do 25 to 50 sit-ups depending on the situation and changing it up and all that. And then I'll do squats, and all that has helped tremendously. And I'm down to 220, and I was as high as 255. So I'm like, I feel pretty good about that. So I'm like, all right, I need to continue on in this new year, I guess. So.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. I did something similar as well. So, but anyway, so for this episode, we're doing the last segment of our conversation with Jackson. And as you all remember, we split it up into 3 different shows just so that we won't have to run one super hellaciously long show. So we split it up into 3. We didn't all record it all at one session on purpose so that, again, we knew it was going to be spread out like this. So we're now into the new year. And so we're going to bring them on. Andy, I don't know if you might want to recap a little bit about what we did before or...
Well, we're talking about, supply chain and resiliency and things of that nature. And so, it's looking at trying to vet things. You're looking at policies. You're looking at your own internal company and processes and all that. And what you should be doing, the vetting process, the new regulations are coming in. There's so many new regulations that in particular for vetting for denied parties, restricted party screening, there's the Forced Labor Prevention Acts. There is, global initiatives where new sanctions are coming in and all of that. It is hard to keep up with it. So with that, talking and basically laying out the scenario that we're doing is that it's laying the groundwork that, okay, this is a big deal. And it's somewhat monumental. This would be, from a policy perspective and an overall vision of you want to be compliant. Well, today's show, we're going to get into, how do we actually do it? Because it's so much information that a lot of compliance folks out there, y'all have, you're usually treated somewhat like a stepchild a little bit, is like you're overworked, understaffed, all that kind of stuff. This is an area where we're going to talk into where working smarter, not harder. So with that, we're going to be bringing on Jackson from Descartes that has had the previous 2 shows on this and getting into some really good nitty gritty type things. So, Jackson, welcome back to us, sir. I want you again remind the folks of your position there with Descartes and your a little bit of your background.
Sure, and great to be back with you, Andy, Lalo. It's been so much fun in our previous conversation. So, as you say, my name's Jackson Wood. I'm the Director of Industry Strategy in the Global Trade Intelligence Business Unit here at Descartes. I've been in and around global trade compliance for the better part of 20 years, so most of my career, and have spent time really working in all different facets of the space. So whether that's on the research and development side, whether that's on the customer engagement side, trying to understand policy, trying to understand some of the regulatory implications that customers that are conducting international trade are navigating. So as you say, Andy, it's a monumental time in our space as we've got so many different moving parts from a regulatory perspective. We've got so many different considerations that organizations are having to navigate through, not only on the regulatory side, but as we've talked about previously, on the reputational side, on the business resiliency side. And so I think you framed it up well in that what we hopefully can arm the audience with today are some very practical tips around, hey, what specific things can we do from an operational perspective to try to set ourselves up for success? And we talked about in our previous episodes around, hey, a lot of organizations are struggling with some of these challenges purely from an internal governance perspective. Who's accountable for driving compliance and alignment? Who are the different subject matter experts that need to be at the table? What are the different data assets that we need to take advantage of? And we talked about the framework that can be a really helpful place to start. So thinking about our exposure from a regulatory risk perspective, thinking about how we want to protect our image and reputation, and ultimately how we want to make sure that we're building resilient relationships, particularly for those critical suppliers that are essential to our business. And so today we can talk about, all right, you've got yourselves organized internally. We know who the executive sponsor is. We know who the stakeholders that we need to have engaged are. Now let's talk specifically about some of the steps that group can take. So my hope is that the audience today will really be able to walk away with some very practical steps they can use in their organization.
Well, and to your point, Jackson, I will say I want to stop for our audience again. If you're looking at this, especially if you're in an executive leadership role or a middle management role, you may have some folks and processes that you've automated some of these things. Some of it may be a little bit overwhelming and going, I don't know where to go with this. This may be a show that in particular you need to look at. Hopefully it's going to stimulate you to be thinking and give you some ideas of, hey, you know what? Here's a potential solution, how they work it to, again, process, millions of bits of information, and work smarter, not harder kind of thing. And with that, then there will be some follow-up that you can take and start asking questions internally. Whether you are an actual importer, exporter scenario, whether you are a service provider. If you're a service provider, there's a lot of things that could be done. Yeah, you can offer, especially if you're a 3PL, 4PL type operation, where there's some things you should be able to offer your clients, but you may not even have the systems or software, or maybe you need to upgrade some systems or software. Well, this will be a way for us to talk through this so that you can get some ideas and figure out, who you want to go with. But again, if you can hear what some people are offering, this is a good way for you to be more of a entranced into your own client, to offering them better services because of your own software situation. So, Jackson, where do we want to start? It's like, again, as we're looking through this, how do you want to go through this here?
Sure. Well, I think there's sort of two pieces to this, at least how we've always thought about it at Descartes and how we try to work with our customers, right? Because you raise a really important point, Andy, in that particularly those in the audience who've spent a lot of time working in the global trade arena, one thing we know is there's also almost infinite amounts of data that we could be looking at and interrogating at any given time, right? So whether that's compliance information about our products, compliance information about the jurisdictions that we're working in. Like, there's really no end to the different data that we could try to leverage. But there's also the question around, how do we leverage it appropriately? How do we turn it into an asset that can actually enable us to generate insights about our business? And so how we've always thought about this particular challenge at Descartes is decision makers from a global trade and from a compliance perspective need those two things. They need access to the right data, but they also need the right capabilities to be able to leverage that data effectively. And so,
okay, hang on just a second. You've hit an extremely important point here. So I want to say this to our compliance folks in particular, your logistics, your transportation folks and your departments. Giving your executive leadership access to the system or information, well, that doesn't mean they're going to go and just access the information. It's like you need to be able to prepare your information from your own departments and put it in a format that can be easily summarized and empower your executive leadership with the right information to influence the decisions that need to be made. All right. To do that, again, there's all this information that needs to be analyzed. And we all know this. People will look at it and let's say that there's a chart that's generated and say, here's a graph, here's a trend or whatever. Well, you see the one graph. What's not seen, but a lot of people have an appreciation behind that to generate that graph was probably the assimilation of a great deal of information and data. And it had to be analyzed and then trended out. Well, this is what you're talking about, is that doing that and having access to that is empowering the department heads to get the information, analyze it, and then put it in a format to executive management. Is that a good summary there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're talking about the sort of top end of all of this work, where you're actually, the internal collaboration efforts are generating insights about the business that can then be leveraged by the executive decision-making level of the organization to say, hey, we have to get out of this jurisdiction from a supply risk perspective, and we got to pivot to either nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring, whatever alternative approach that we want to take. But it's not as easy as just saying we want to do that. There's a lot of analytics and synthesis that has to happen to enable those strategic decisions to be made. And so that's really what I'm trying to get to ground with in terms of how we design our solutions at Descartes, is we recognize that the slickest software in the world is useless if it's not leveraging the most accurate and up-to-date global trade information. But it's just as accurate to say all of that incredible data, as timely and as up-to-date as it might be, is really not helpful if there aren't ways to effectively leverage it, right? And so that's what we talk about, global trade intelligence being the synthesis of this complete, accurate, and up-to-date data ecosystem with cutting-edge technology that's able to effectively leverage that content. And there's companies in our world that do one of those two things really well. And of course, I'm biased here, but I believe that we do the best job of bringing those two things together and creating a decision support platform for organizations to be able to get the insights they need to effectively mitigate risk across their supply chain.
And Jackson, let me interrupt here real quickly. And of course, again, not to plug or do anything like what Global Training Center does, what we do here at Global Training Center. But my experience, I did work for 25 years in a software company that did GTM, et cetera. You know, so anyway, so I have that background as well. What I saw also, and then what do you think about this? Is what I saw was that as good as the software may be, of course, ours was the best. I wrote it, you know, and so anyway, but like you said, being biased. But anyway, what I saw was that, okay, so the software may be able to give you that and back in the day it was a NAFTA certificate. It will give you the NAFTA certificate. It's really good. It's strong. It has a lot of support and everything behind it. But the day that customs comes and audits you, they're not going to, you can't say, yeah, the software told me. You know what I mean? It's like you need to know. So again, I don't know, how does that factor in, like the education level of that user? Because I mean, yeah, the software is great. AI is getting better and better. It's going to give you a lot more. But I mean, I just kind of want to advocate for those people that think AI or software is going to take their job. You know what I'm saying? Because that's not true.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, and like you, Lalo, I have been around the software business since 2002. So I have seen a lot of evolution and a lot of really positive impacts that technology's had in solving these types of business challenges. But the one thing that I have always gone to pains to try to help our customers or prospective customers understand is you can't look at technology as a perfect solution to all of the problems that you have. Technology is an enabling tool that can help your people be more successful in ultimately enabling your organization to be successful. But the biggest failures I have ever seen in software implementations, and this is across the board, this isn't just in our global trade space, this is in customers where a big ERP implementation has fallen flat or a CRM implementation has fallen flat, in that the expectations of the organization was the software is going to solve all our problems. And that's just not how it works. The people in your organization are going to solve your problems, but they need tools to do it effectively and efficiently. And that's where really strong technology is a game changer. It's not replacing people and it's not supplanting people. It's extending and enabling the capabilities that your people have, because it's giving them, as we talked about, it's giving them access to the right data and the ability to leverage that data effectively to make the best possible compliance decisions they can for their business.
I like the way people are saying these days, and they're saying use software and technology as your co-pilot. You know, because they're running side by side with you. They're your co-pilot. They're not the captain of the ship or anything, because you know you cannot let it be. You know. So anyway, that was just the other point. Yeah.
And one other thing that I would say, and I think this really does resonate with our compliance folks when we're talking about some of the value that technology can bring to their practice, is so often we hear, and I'm sure Lalo, you hear this all the time, I wish we could spend more time educating our organization about why compliance matters and about what some of the really important sensitivities that our business entails and why we have to work as a team to navigate through this. But compliance teams are consistently under resourced. They're strapped with respect to where their priorities are. And they're so busy scrambling to do these operational requirements that they can't liberate their capacity to go and do this education. So technology solutions can significantly reduce the operational burden of things like denied, restricted, sanctioned party screening. We can significantly accelerate the work required to do item classification, both on the import and the export side. So think about it not necessarily as complete automation, where you're going to be quote unquote replacing people. You're actually going to be liberating the capacity of your experts so that they can then spread across the organization, preach the gospel of compliance, help the rest of the business understand why this is important, with the full confidence that those really key operational things like denied, restricted, sanctioned party screening, like item classification, like agreement management, a lot of that can be happening embedded within the business systems that your organization is already relying on.
The use of automation empowers people to become obviously much more productive. That's one of the things we're saying. But what I take it is that it moves them beyond becoming, if you will, like an overpaid clerk. They're just pushing paper, they're pushing data, whatever, doing. I hate to use the term menial tasks, but mundane, everyday type tasks and whatever. It takes that and helps them to become more productive, so that the automation helps in that very realm. Now, these very same people who are proficient in what they're looking at can move on to the next level to start analyzing some of that data and start applying their expertise that they have into areas that really need their expertise. Whereas before, they were so busy trying to classify new parts, trying to handle exceptions, trying to deal and process transactions that the automation's taken care of. Now they're able to move forward with what's the word I'm looking for? Putting the expertise where it needs to be. Would that be good as far as that?
Absolutely. And it helps to transition. And we talked about this in one of our previous conversations about how much the Russia-Ukraine conflict elevated the perception of compliance organizations in these international businesses, right? So for the longest time, compliance has been seen as a headwind to the business. I have a former colleague who ran trade compliance at a very large international manufacturer. And he said, my team and I were always referred to as the sales prevention team, right? Because all we ever did was tell the commercial folks what they couldn't do, right? Oh, we've got this $50 million deal. Sorry, we can't do business in that jurisdiction, right? And so it was always, the perception has frequently been of compliance being that friction point of telling us what we can't do. Let's take advantage of the fact that we've had this moment in the sun where organizations are recognizing the strategic value that compliance can offer. And let's make sure we're building on that opportunity. And the only way we can do that is to start. And I agree with you, Andy. We don't want to talk about these things as mundane or sort of low value tasks. They're critically important, but technology has evolved to the point where let's let the tech handle some of those operational requirements, those transactional requirements, so that we are able to add more strategic value to the organization. We're able to partner more effectively with our purchasing colleagues. We're able to partner more effectively with our ethics or sustainability colleagues, right? Because we're not so busy running names through screening tools that ultimately that work could be automated to happen within workflows in your ERP, in your CRM, et cetera. And so that's really a key point to think about.
All right. Well, some of the things we've been talking about is the results of using automation into the system. And with that is obviously getting good data from a statistical perspective, trends, analysis, all that. Also being able to empower somebody that is going to be more productive so that they can now handle some of the exceptions, the issues that probably need their expertise. It all comes back to now, what are we talking about as far as a system? I mean, it comes down to implementing some of the systems down to the transaction level or whatever else. So if somebody's interested, all right, I want to do this. What is it that we're talking about here as far as, that would start this automation process? Because it's going to be an integrated scenario here where you're going to have a lot of systems connectivity at some point, and you got to start somewhere.
Yeah. So I think it's important that we maybe zoom out a bit and talk about the different dimensions that technology can take on in the context of global trade, right? So we have the traditional, what we call global trade management systems, right? So these are the SAP GTS, the Oracle GTM, the E2 Open, the Thomson Reuters OneSource. Like these are the global trade management platforms that streamline and automate all of the critical elements of global trade transactions, right? So we're talking about classification, we're talking about purchase order management, we're talking about bill of materials, building and exchanging information with financial systems, transportation management systems, et cetera. So there's that piece of it. And that's well understood. That's a fairly mature space. A lot of organizations are familiar with and utilizing that technology. I think where the next frontier is, and this is where we're spending a lot of time working with our customers, is saying, hey, there's a lot of pieces to global trade that are up and downstream of where the boundaries of traditional global trade management might fall. And so to your question, Andy, I think what we recommend to a lot of our clients is, okay, what's the actual starting point of a lot of your global trade activities? Well, it's in where you're sourcing raw materials for your supply chain, or it's where you're thinking about either existing or emerging markets where you want to transact business. So how do we identify either risks or opportunities outside of a live global trade transaction? So we're not talking about shipments that are necessarily in flight where we've got a container on its way to a particular destination. We're now taking a deep breath, thinking strategically about the markets that we source from, the markets that we sell to. How can we generate insights about what's happening in those jurisdictions? And so a company like ours offers a solution that allows you to get to ground, and whether that's using things like HTS codes, whether that's using trade lane volume, whether that's using particular characteristics of the third parties that you're working with, to map out not only what your present exposure is from that particular commodity or jurisdiction perspective, but where might you have alternatives to consider, right? So let's take you've got an HTS code for whatever that key commodity that is absolutely essential to your business. Let's look at other places and other suppliers where you might be able to get that commodity. And as you talked about, Andy, there are very powerful data visualization and analytic tools that turn that into a heat map, right? We're not talking about reams and reams spreadsheets where someone's got to go through line by line and try to connect the dots. We're talking about a very insightful, easy to process visual map of saying we're potentially overexposed in this jurisdiction, but that's not necessarily a problem because these other jurisdictions and these other suppliers might be able to provide that commodity for you, right? So now we have an entirely new set of information to work with. But as you said, that's not enough to just say, oh, okay, well, we're overinvested in this particular supplier. Let's switch to this one. There's a lot of things that you've got to consider in that transition, right? So now you can use a tool to, and again, I'm biased here, so I'm going to say like the Descartes tool that allows you to say, okay, let's look at this jurisdiction. Let's look at this supplier in more detail, right? Are there going to be landed cost or other financial considerations if we switch from this jurisdiction to this other jurisdiction? Can we even do business in this jurisdiction? What about that supplier? So how are we going to do a repeatable workflow that allows us to go from identifying that alternative supplier or that alternative market, look at it from a financial perspective, and also then look at it from a compliance perspective? And this is, I think, a novel way to think about how global trade technology can help businesses navigate through some of these changes. Is it's not just about the traditional purview of global trade management platforms that are tying together and automated the transactional pieces of trade in flight. It's now about, as I say, let's zoom out, let's be more strategic and think about how we can use some of the same data that powers global trade management systems, but let's use that to paint a more strategic picture of our global business that then ultimately can flow into how the trade management system runs our day-to-day trade operations.
Okay, so to your point, let's in like you're saying, let's zoom out. The one thing that it sounds like to, if you will, apply this is that the groups that would be involved when you're talking about, well, is there another source for this product? We're getting it. Let's say, again, it's so many are getting things from China, but whatever location you're getting it from, that's going to be that purchasing and sourcing group that needs to be involved. But I also would go so far as to say, as you're looking at that, if you are an owner or an executive or leader in a leadership position, you ought to be looking at a group that would be your purchasing sourcing group, your logistics transportation group, and your compliance folks at a bare minimum. Those three alone, where as you're looking at some, and then maybe even from a marketing perspective as well. But I mean, the point being is, as you're looking at that and taking the information. So let's say that I've got a commodity and it has a harmonized tariff 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is. You've got it. Do you have a system that I would plug that in that says, okay, here's the other sources? Or is it a case to say, okay, here's the top commodities that I'm importing or exporting or whatever importing in this case, and then taking that data and going and doing a Google search on something or something? How are we talking about here? How Descartes can help with this?
You described it very well, Andy. So take an HTS code, put it into our market insight engine, and the market insight engine can then help you determine what are our other options. So it's not just necessarily other countries. Maybe, fortunately or unfortunately, the only country in the world that provides that critical raw material for you is located here. So you don't have a ton of options. But maybe there are other companies that are shipping that product out of that country, and maybe they're using a different trade lane. Maybe they're using different carriers. Maybe there are things that alternative supplier is doing that could make it a more attractive option for you. And you're able to start getting that level of insight just from the HTS code, right? So it's exactly as you described. This does need to be a bit of a collaborative effort, but working from a single data point, you can unlock a lot of insight about how you might be able to either reduce risk or strengthen resiliency in your supply chain just because you're able to get that representation of other options. You're not just single threaded with that one particular organization that you're dependent on. You're now able to start seeing that there may be other options for you to contemplate. You can then use that same information, take that, I don't know, either that supplier name or take that harmonized tariff code and then look at what are the duty and tax landed cost implications for that particular commodity. Also, if it is in another jurisdiction, are there any country restrictions, embargoes, other types of export or import controls that may exist at the jurisdictional level? So it's available. It makes sense from a cost perspective, but unfortunately, we're not able to, from a regulatory perspective, complete that transaction. And what we try to do at Descartes is knit all of those different decision points together so that a collaborative group can actually follow that thread and say, from an alternative source to the commercial implications of working with an alternative source to the regulatory implications of working with that source, we are now at a point at the end of that workflow to say, hey, this decision makes a ton of sense for our business, right? It's not any decisions being made in isolation where hey, we found the lowest cost supplier. Let's make the recommendation up to the executive team that we should switch here. You've done a lot more due diligence. You've connected a lot more dots so that the executive decision makers can have far more confidence that this is a sound business decision for us to take.
To your point, that's the one thing that I am a big proponent of, again, doing it in a collaborative effort. So often you have folks that, again, your purchasing, sourcing folks, your transportation, and then your compliance all have different main focuses, if you will, almost like different agendas. And as they're looking at that, there is more to saying, hey, I found a source that can manufacture this widget for, instead of 50 cents an item, it's down to 45 cents an item or whatever it is, it's all relative. But then what they don't take into account is the added transportation cost. And then there may be, additional duties and taxes and or additional tariffs and whatnot. So if you look at it, basically what you're saying is it's a good sound business decision. It's something that's done and looked at holistically. So as I'm looking at this from an executive perspective, folks, if you're looking at this and hearing what we're saying is that you really need to pull at least those three entities together, your purchasing, sourcing, your logistics, transportation folks, and then your compliance. And if the three of them together, and it doesn't have to be necessarily, upper management folks that are doing this, the frontline folks that have some tenure could say, hey, we want to find other sources for this particular product. And you turn them loose and they're out there doing the grunt work, if you will, of the systems you're looking at and going out and vetting that and coming back with a recommendation. Here's two other alternatives. Here's our current one. And here's two other alternatives, or whatever the case may be. That then can be looked at from a management perspective. The good thing about that is you hit on something else. Maybe the raw materials only comes from a specific location. At least you have stopped wondering, well, I wonder if there's any other location around the world. You've nailed it down to say, for sure, this is the locations or here are the sources. Great. Then you go from there and say, what else can I do with that? So I love that idea and looking at that from a strategic perspective. And as far as in that, I guess that would be something. Is this a system that would be, it's a, web-based type system, or is this something that I have to buy your software package and install it and do all that? What are we talking about here?
We really pride ourselves on being a software as a service entity, right? So we really try to deliver the majority of our technology software as a service, so it's all accessible online. Obviously, we have integration capabilities using things like web service APIs that enable transactional elements of global trade to be embedded in business systems. So things like denied party screening, et cetera, where there is some implementation that needs to be done on the customer side. But a lot of our solutions are completely web-based, accessible by anybody who's got a web browser. And so you can imagine a collaborative session where you've got some procurement folks in the room, you've got some logistics transportation folks in the room, you've got some trade compliance folks in the room that would be able to have a web-based system in front of them and say, okay, we've done a risk stratification exercise where we've identified the top 5 raw materials that are most critical to our business. Okay. We're going to do a collaborative exercise where we try to identify if there are any options to de-risk our supply chain. So let's start with the HTS code. We can look at, as I mentioned, powerful data visualization tools that allow you to see in a heat map type format where those alternative suppliers may be located, how you might be able to optimize your relationship with those suppliers. Then with the same web-based technology, let's interrogate that HTS code and understand if we do move from one jurisdiction to the other, are there going to be tariff or tax implications? Is this suboptimal from a landed cost perspective? And then finally, web-based system, let's look at this jurisdiction to see if there's any sanctions, restrictions, embargoes. Let's run the name of that supplier or that entity to see if they're on any restricted, sanctioned, or barred party list. Like that could all happen in one coordinated workflow, right? And so I think that's really what we're trying to help our customers understand is it's an intimidating challenge. We're talking about multiple stakeholder groups inside of an organization. What data assets are we going to take advantage of? There are tools available. We just have to think a little bit creatively about how to take advantage of them. As I said, global trade tools have been around for a long time, and a lot of organizations are using them in traditional ways. But now's the time, we talk about it's a new year. We're prioritizing what's going to be top of mind for us as we move through 2024. I think this is a really novel way to think about maybe taking advantage of tools we know about, maybe even some of the tools we have. Let's use them in creative and innovative ways to try to help our business stay ahead of the curve with respect to compliance and risk challenge.
And the other scenario there is that as you're doing, I guess this would kind of come along the lines of a strategic sourcing type effort. All your companies, you have your operations, you've got your sources, you got things going on. But one of the things that comes into play is, if there are tensions, right now there's, huge tensions between China and the U.S. Okay, that's one thing. There's another one here that comes into play that, the geopolitical scenarios going on around the world can disrupt your supply chain. So, if you have a major supplier in Taiwan, that's another one there that's like, okay, I'm going to move from China to Taiwan is what a lot of folks said, but Taiwan itself was just supplying a whole lot. You play the what if. You've got to do your strategic planning and what if China does do an attack on Taiwan and take it over? What do you think is going to happen? Well, you got 2 scenarios that's probably going to happen. Is that one, the sources of goods coming out of Taiwan is going to be cut off. Well, the U.S. then in retaliation is going to cut off, supply out of China. So there's 2 major sources right there. Are you prepared for that? And what are your other sources? And doing when the proverbial, what hits the fan is a little too late to try and do strategic planning. You're into crisis management at that point. So this is a way to become more, intuitive and looking outside that realm. Well, the other scenario here is look at what else is, there are some products that come out of Israel. and the Israel-Palestinian situation and all that is disrupted right now. Is it, supply still coming on, or it's minimized? Same thing with Ukraine and Russia and all of that. So when you're doing your supply chain or your strategic planning, this is one of those that a collaborative effort is paramount. And second to that is getting the right information that would empower you to be able to stay focused.
Absolutely, absolutely spot on, Andy. The one thing that I would add to that, because I've seen a lot of organizations make this mistake when they start to get into the scenario planning and twinning supply chains and having, all of these sort of options on the table, is if you don't start from an accurate baseline, all of the scenarios that you plan for could be for naught, right? And so I think that it's not as fun sometimes to say, hey, do we actually have a complete understanding of the current state of our supply chain? Do we have a good sense of where we have regulatory exposure, where we might have reputational exposure, where we might have some resiliency exposure? So if your organization doesn't have that strong baseline established, I'd strongly recommend the first order of business is let's get current state really well understood. And then we can get into this more advanced step of starting to do scenario planning and what ifs around, whether it's at the jurisdictional level, whether it's at the commodity level, but don't skip the really important step of having a clear baseline of where you're at today, because otherwise all of the scenarios that you map out for the future, they might tell you something that's not true.
What would you recommend, Jackson, if somebody's listening to this going, you know what, I want to follow up on this to at least investigate, what I could be able to do, how much it may cost me, whatever the case is. What would be the actions that you would recommend for somebody in this realm to say, hey, we need to talk about this or whatever, or take action?
As much as I would love to say, call us at Descartes and we've got some great technology that will sell you, like, it starts with the internal discussions around, do we understand where we're exposed from a regulatory perspective? Do we understand where we're exposed from a reputational perspective and from a resiliency perspective? Do we have the executive support and do we have the internal alignment to bring the different disciplines and the different stakeholders in our business together to try to tackle these challenges? Because as we've talked about, it's not just going to be one team or one individual who has to solve these types of challenges. It's going to be a multi-actor approach. It's going to take everybody. It's going to take different data. It's going to take different expertise. If you feel like you've got organized internally, then yes, let's have a conversation about how companies like Descartes might be able to help you from a technology perspective. But what I don't want to do is create the sense in people that, hey, all I got to do is call Descartes and they're going to sell me some really good tools and that, we'll be done and dusted, right? We'll have some really cool technology that's going to solve all these problems for us. We take pride in the fact of, if we have a customer or potential customer reach out to us and say, we want to have technology that does this and this and this and this, we won't sell it to you if you're not in a position to take advantage of the technology effectively. And that might sound a little bit counterintuitive from a software perspective, but we ultimately succeed when our customers succeed. And as I said, the software doesn't solve the problem. The software enables the people in your business to solve the problems. So if we're not organized and we're not aligned on the people side, let's take care of that. And then let's talk about how really great global trade content and really great global trade technology can work together to help those collaborative teams be successful.
I will say that I have conducted some things over my career and some meetings and whatnot, and we were able to get representatives from multiple departments. And the whole concept is like, we see an opportunity here that where you would be able to streamline some of your supply chain and shore up some of the weak links in your supply chain from a compliance standpoint. And the key was getting an executive to sponsor that effort. And before any of the automation came into play, it was that discussion. And what was phenomenal, we had people from customer service, from compliance, from logistics, from legal, from IT, from sourcing, from a few other areas. And as we went through some things, we were talking about exceptions and different things. And it was phenomenal that when we started facilitating, I was facilitating the discussion, but to your point, it was like, okay, it got to a certain point where it's like, what are you doing as far as even sharing information? What are you doing as far as what do you do with what I give you? And all of a sudden he's like, well, if you supplied one more data element in your purchase order or one more element in your customer service order or whatever, and it started going through, and the room just erupted in great conversations and whatever. And I had to step back, and I didn't want to move. I was still standing up, but the conversation was growing, and it was fantastic. And that particular one was a major cell phone company. The other one was a chip manufacturer, and the third one was a huge healthcare company. And all that to say is that in every one of those, it went on for about 10, 15 minutes, and we made significant progress. And making notes and all that. And all of a sudden they realized, oh, wait, let's turn it back over. It's like, no, this is exactly what we needed. They were then primed to say, we need a system to help us manage it. And all of a sudden it was all like a joint effort rather than a bunch of silos. All of a sudden then you had one team. So folks, if you're looking out there, I would just say once again that what Jackson is putting forward is a great, concept here in looking at what you need to do and pulling your team together, talk about it. And then from there, you can figure out what else you want to do with that, right?
Couldn't have said it better myself, Andy.
Well, Jackson, once again, I think we've had a very good show. I think this is going to be a great one for people to come back and reference as well. And Lalo, anything from you as far as what we've been talking about? I know all this data and software is more in your ball game.
No, I mean, just bringing back memories, good or bad, but they're memories of those days, But anyway, Jackson, I do want to give you the last word if you want to wrap up, and we'll end the show with that.
Sure. So just two things. If you don't know where to start, the assessment framework is essential. Let's look at our business from a regulatory risk perspective, from a reputational risk perspective, and from a resiliency for risk perspective. Let's get the right stakeholders and experts inside of our organization together and agree that these are the lenses through which we want to look at our international operations, our supply chain. Once we're organized, once we have a good sense of where we are exposed to risk or where we may have opportunities, then let's make sure we get access to the right global trade data and have the right global trade tools to help us take advantage of that data to connect the dots and generate the insights we need to help our business be successful. As I say, I'm very biased. I think Descartes is very well positioned to help companies in this space. And I would love the opportunity our whole company would love the opportunity to speak with anything and help share our knowledge and our experience helping global organizations navigate these challenges.
Jackson, thank you, sir. I appreciate you. And folks, I mean, this is, again, a show that I hope that we would love to hear your feedback. Make your comments on LinkedIn, connect with us, share this one. And in particular, if there's any issues that you have further question on, let us know, and we'll make sure we get back to you and respond back to you.
That's it. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your year.
There you go.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.